Two men, one lifted in a whirlwind of flame, the other who would lay his cloak across a river and inherit a double portion of power, shaped the fate of a nation. Their names are Elijah and Elisha, and their stories are not merely ancient curiosities. They are a study in how God breaks into human history, how prophetic power is exercised, how loneliness and provision walk together, and how divine authority is passed from one generation to the next. This is the incredible journey of Elijah and Elisha. Discover their prophetic power. To understand what happens on a mountaintop and beside a river, we must first look at the ground on which the drama unfolds. The northern kingdom of Israel stood at a precipice. King Ahab sat on the throne, married to Jezebel, a foreign queen who promoted the worship of Baal, a fertility god foreign to the covenantal worship of Yahweh. Altars to Baal rose, where altars to the Lord should have stood. Prophets of the Lord were hidden or hunted. The culture had changed its loyalty, and with that change came a moral and spiritual disintegration that threatened the very identity of God's people. 1 Kings 16-18 provide the narrative background. Into this landscape steps a startling figure, Elijah of Tishbe, a man whose dress and demeanor mark him as a prophetic outsider. He appears where he must, speaks when he must, and refuses to be co-opted by palace religion. His ministry begins with a word that rings like thunder over the hills. A drought will come, no rain until the Lord declares it. 1 Kings 17:1. It is a provocative act. The prophet declares judgment not as mere rhetoric, but as a covenantal consequence. Drought in the ancient Near East is not incidental. It reveals the fragility of human systems and the dependence of nations on the God who controls the weather, and by extension, history. Elijah's first days after that pronouncement are striking for their intimacy with God's provision, and for the oddity of the instruments God chooses. The Lord tells him to hide by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan, and while he hides, ravens bring him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. He drinks from the brook. 1 Kings 17:2-6. Think for a moment about the symbolism. Ravens are unclean birds in Levitical terms, not the first creature one would call a domestic helper. Yet God uses what is available. The choice itself is theological. God will provide, and God will do so in ways that subvert expectations. When the brook dries up because of the drought, God directs Elijah to Zarephath, a town of Sidon, outside Israelite territory, where a widow will sustain him. 1 Kings 17:7-9. This relocation is the first of many signs that God's work often reaches beyond the boundaries we expect. The widow's pantry contains only a handful of flour and a little oil, enough for one last meal. Elijah asks her to make him a cake first. The test is radical. She complies. The outcome is a small, sustained miracle. The jar of flour and the jug of oil do not run out for many days. The narrative invites us into a theology of provision that is both intimate and communal. A prophet is fed by a poor woman, and through that poverty, God demonstrates abundance. Here is a theological inversion. God uses scarcity to reveal sufficiency, outsider to sustain prophet, foreign soil to house God's faithful servant. The story turns darker and deeper with the sudden death of the widow's son. 1 Kings 17:17-24. The child becomes ill and dies. The mother blames Elijah and, in raw grief, turns her sorrow toward the prophet she had welcomed. Elijah takes the boy, carries him to an upper room, stretches himself upon the child 3 times, pleads with the Lord, and the child's life returns. The scene is intimate and theologically packed. A prophet intercedes with desperation. The life-giving power is not in the prophet himself, but in the God whom the prophet names and calls upon, and the result is restoration. The people's faith is reaffirmed. The widow confesses that Elijah is a man of God and that the word of the Lord in his mouth is truth. There are a few points worth pausing over in this sequence. First, notice how the narrative links provision and life. God feeds Elijah, provides for a household, and raises a life, not as a magical formula, but as signs of a God who cares for both the messenger and the marginalized. Second, the instruments are unexpected. Ravens, a foreign widow, a prophet's desperate prayer. This pattern will recur. God chooses unlikely avenues to display divine power so that the source of life and provision is clearly divine, not human. From the quiet of a widow's home, the narrative pivots to one of the most dramatic confrontations in the Hebrew Scriptures, the showdown on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18. The stakes could not be clearer. Jezebel has promoted Baal worship, and the nation is spiritually fractured. Elijah challenges Israel to a test, 2 altars, 2 sets of prophets, and an appeal to the God who alone can send fire from heaven. The scene is theatrical, but deeply theological. Elijah's challenge to the people, "How long will you go limping between 2 different opinions?" is less about theatrical spectacle and more about calling people to spiritual fidelity. Picture Mount Carmel, 2 altars built, bulls placed upon them, preparation from both sides. The prophets of Baal, 450 of them, and the prophets of Asherah face Elijah's single voice. The Baal prophets call all day, climb upon their altar, slash themselves in ritual frenzy, and yet there is no answer. Elijah mocks the futility. Perhaps Baal is asleep or busy or on a journey. Call louder. It is a mournful satire of false religion. The frantic activity produces no presence. Elijah then takes his turn. He repairs the altar of the Lord, arranges the wood, places the bull, and makes a small, scandalous demand. Pour water over the offering until the trench around the altar is filled. He does this not for spectacle's sake, but to magnify the miracle. When he prays, the fire of the Lord falls, consuming not only the wood and the sacrifice, but the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. 1 Kings 18:30-38. The people fall prostrate and cry, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" In that moment, the truth of the covenant God is vindicated. The aftermath is complicated and sobering. Elijah orders the capture of the prophets of Baal. The text reports their execution at the brook Kishon, where their bodies are thrown. This is an act that must be handled sensitively. The narrative context sits within the covenantal world of Israel, where idolatry is not a private peccadillo, but a breach of communal fidelity that in the ancient judicial imagination invited severe measures. The story does not invite us to relish death. It calls us to see how seriously covenant unfaithfulness was regarded and how God's prophet stands as a remediator of covenant purity. We must also hold in tension the biblical witness. God is merciful, but the story portrays the consequences of organized idolatry within the covenant community. Immediately after the victory of fire comes another sign, rain. Elijah prays for rain, sends his servant 7 times to look toward the sea. A small cloud appears, the heavens open, and after years of drought, the rain returns. 1 Kings 18:41-45. The prophet's authority is thus confirmed in both judgment and restoration. God controls the sky and the land. In the brief space between miracle and relief, another personal detail testifies to the prophet's vigor. Elijah runs before Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. It is an image of prophetic zeal, one man running under the mantle of God's vindication. If you find this account stirring, if the confrontation between the true God and false gods, the dramatic reversal from drought to rain, or the raw simplicity of a widow's faith grips you, then stay connected. If these journeys through the biblical world encourage you to dive deeper into the text and its meaning for today, subscribe and join this series so we can unpack more together. Vindication on Carmel, however, does not end the story with applause. The victory exposes another truth. Human power remains unconverted at the top. Jezebel hears what happened and vows retribution, promising Elijah death. Her threat is not a small knit of palace anger. It is lethal and personal. Elijah responds in fear. The prophet who stood alone on Carmel now flees into the wilderness, a dramatic reversal from public triumph to private collapse. 1 Kings 19, 1-4. He goes a day's journey into the wilderness, sits under a broom tree, and prays for death. "I have had enough," he says, "take my life." This confession, raw and human, confronts us with the cost of prophetic ministry. Power and public vindication do not inoculate one against despair. God's response to Elijah's collapse is tender and measured in a way that subverts all expectations of what prophetic life should look like. An angel touches him, provides food and drink, and as the text says, strengthens him for a 40-day journey to Horeb, the mountain of God. 1 Kings 19, 5-8. There is no shout from heaven here, no dramatic commotion to match the noise of Carmel. The meter of God's care is small: food, rest, and a long walk. Theological reflection here matters. God does not rebuke Elijah with the words, "You failed." God nourishes him, acknowledges his limits, and carries him forward. At Horeb, the scene becomes quietly electrifying. Elijah experiences a theophany, but not as he expects. There is a wind that rends the mountains and breaks rocks, an earthquake, and a fire, mighty and dramatic, yet the Lord is not in these. After the fire comes a sound that is small, a whisper, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19, 11-12. The Hebrew phrase conveys the intimacy of God's speech, not a vacuum of noise, but a refined, close-breathed word. For a prophet accustomed to consuming fire from heaven, God's presence in a whisper is disorienting. This is a theological pivot. While God can and does act with cosmic force, the shaping of a life and the issuing of callings often come in gentle speech rather than spectacle. In that whisper, God asks the strangest pastoral question: "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It is not a mere interrogation, it is an invitation to reflection. Elijah answers with the language of isolation and accusation. He has been zealous for the Lord. The people have forsaken God's covenant. The prophets have been slaughtered. He alone remains. God's reply reframes the situation. Elijah is not alone. There are 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. 1 Kings 19, 9-18. God speaks of a remnant, an enduring group whose faith preserves covenantal continuity. This revelation reframes prophetic identity. The prophet is not the sole guarantor of faith's survival. The mantle of prophetic responsibility does not rest on singular shoulders, even when it feels so to the person who bears it. There is a communal preservation at work. God preserves a faithful core in the nation. This idea of remnant runs throughout Scripture and offers pastoral solace. Faithful presence, even in minority, matters in God's economy. There is another shift here. Rather than merely returning Elijah to the hilltops of prophetic triumph, God commissions him again. The Lord gives him tasks beyond his current horizon, anointing new kings and appointing a successor. Succession is hard work in any movement. It is one thing to be a firebrand prophet. It is another to imagine someone else taking up the mantle. God's plans include continuity, not just isolated brilliance. Elijah's story up to this point highlights several threads we must not miss. First, prophetic power is rooted in the sovereignty of God over nature and nations. Elijah prays, God sends rain. Elijah calls, and God answers in fire. Second, prophetic work is costly. Public confrontation and private collapse belong to the same life. Third, God often provides through unlikely people and means, ravens, a widow, a small cloud in the sky, so that human credit is minimized and divine action maximized. Fourth, God's presence can be both spectacular and intimate. The same God who sends consuming fire also speaks in a whisper. Finally, God preserves a remnant and plans for succession. None of these truths reduce prophecy to spectacle, nor do they allow a prophet to claim power as personal property. The power belongs to God and is entrusted to God's instruments. As we watch Elijah on this ark, confronting kings, calling down drought, being fed by unclean birds, reviving a child, calling fire from heaven, and finally collapsing under a broom tree only to be met by a whisper, we are invited to consider how God forms and reforms leaders. The prophet's life is not a continuous ascent. It is a jagged path, shaped by divine initiative and human frailty. For anyone who aspires to serve, or who is simply trying to remain faithful in a compromised context, Elijah's story offers honest companionship. You may find yourself at Carmel one day and under a bush the next. Consider a few pastoral lessons tucked into these scenes. When the nation's structures had failed, God did not abandon the people to chaos. God sent a prophet who spoke with the authority of covenant. When the prophet himself reached the limits of his strength, God did not shun him. Instead, God provided rest and nourishment, and in due time, a gentle word to steady him. When suffering and loss came, when a child died, when a widow faced starvation, God's solutions were both immediate and relational. When idolatry reigned, God's judgment and mercy worked together to call people back. These are not tidy moral lessons. They are complex theological truths that resist easy appropriation, yet invite deep trust. The narrative so far also raises important theological cautions for us in the present. The spectacular events recorded, fire from heaven, resurrection of a child, rain after drought, are acts of God. They are not formulas. The biblical text resists turning events into mechanistic guarantees. There is no set of steps here that promises a miraculous outcome every time. Prophetic power belongs to God alone. The prophet is an instrument, sometimes faithful, sometimes broken, through which God acts. That is a posture of humility we must recover. Elijah's ministry is a testimony to God's sovereignty, measured both in display and in whisper. As we move from the drama of Carmel into the silence of the wilderness, the story asks us to sit with a paradox. God's vindication and God's gentleness can exist in the same prophetic life. Power and vulnerability, spectacle and solitude, confrontation and consolation. These dualities define the journey. At this threshold, after the whisper and before the commissioning that will set the stage for Elisha, there is a stillness that begs a response. How will the prophet who has seen fire now receive a successor? How will a man who felt alone be reminded of the faithful remnant? How will God move from dramatic public vindication to the intimate work of preparing a next generation? The answers will come, but they require us to follow the narrative into the next stretches of the journey, to watch how mentorship is formed and how prophetic authority is handed on without being privatized. For now, linger with the image of Elijah at Horeb, a man who has stood against armies of idols, who has called down rain and revived the dead, now quiet enough to hear God speak in a whisper. It is a moment that reframes power as a thing that can both consume and caress, that judges and restores, that calls and clarifies the cost of being God's voice in a world that often prefers noise over truth. The incredible journey is only beginning to reveal how prophetic power will travel from one man to another, from one generation to the next, not as a trophy passed along, but as a divine stewardship, entrusted, tested, and then entrusted again. God's answer to Elijah at Horeb was not a curt dismissal, but a set of marching orders that reshaped the next generation. He was told to return, to anoint new kings in Israel and Aram, and, surprisingly, to anoint a successor. Elisha, son of Shaphat, would be the next prophet raised up. 1 Kings 19, 15, 16, 19. The commission reads like a transfer not simply of tasks, but of stewardship. God's plans include continuity. That command sends Elijah homeward, not to linger in isolation, but to find the man who will carry the voice forward. Imagine the meeting as it is narrated. Elisha is at the plough, one among the fields. Life arranged around the ordinary rhythms of family labor. 1 Kings 19:19-21. Elijah approaches and throws his mantle, his prophetic cloak, over Elisha. The gesture is brief but rich in meaning. The cloak, the similar worn by itinerant men, becomes a portable sign of office. It is not just cloth, but symbol. It is the visible indication that God's presence and call might pass from one life to another. Elisha's response is radical. He kills his oxen, boils their meat in the ploughing hearth, gives it to the people, and then follows Elijah. That violent severing of the past, burning the plough, sacrificing the oxen, the public banquet, marks a decisive renunciation of a previous life to embrace a prophetic future. He is not passing by, he is committing. A brief exegetical note helps here. The double portion Elisha later asks for, 2 Kings 2:9, must be read against the backdrop of Israelite inheritance customs. A double portion was the right of the firstborn, a legal recognition that secured economic stability and continuity of family leadership. When Elisha asks for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, he is not bargaining for more power in the sense of personal glory. He is asking to be recognized as Elijah's legitimate spiritual heir, the one who will carry the responsibility and bear the consequences. The request is therefore a plea for standing and for the burden that accompanies it, not for a trophy of miracles. This distinction is important for how we read both men. Prophetic authority in Israel is embedded in accountability and inheritance, not personal aggrandizement. Elisha's years as Elijah's attendant are narrated in shorthand. He follows, he watches, he learns. 1 Kings 19:21, 2 Kings 2. The text deliberately compresses the apprenticeship into scenes that reveal both proximity and preparation. This is a mentorship that is practical. Elisha cooks the food, runs errands, stands beside the master, bears witness to the prophet's public acts and private struggles. He is present at the moments that define prophetic identity: confrontation, prayer, flight, and the quiet times of being fed in wilderness places. Presence, in the biblical imagination, is a school of formation. The final scene of Elijah's earthly ministry is cinematic and charged with symbolic freight. At the Jordan, Elijah and Elisha cross together. Elijah rolls up his cloak, strikes the water, and it parts, recalling the great boundary-crossing deeds of the prophetic tradition, 2 Kings 2:8. Then, in a moment that has riveted readers for centuries, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separate the two men, and Elijah is taken up in a whirlwind into heaven, 2 Kings 2:11. There is awe here that resists simple explanation. A prophet does not die by recorded means. He is translated, carried in divine transport. The image is not only dramatic, it is a theological punctuation, marking the end of Elijah's active public life and the validation of the transfer about to be enacted. Elisha reacts like any devoted apprentice. He cries out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." 2 Kings 2:12. The phrasing recalls military imagery. Elijah is identified with Israel's spiritual defense and underscores the weight of what Elisha is now receiving. He picks up Elijah's cloak that had fallen where Elijah left it, returns to the Jordan, and strikes the water with it. The water parts. The miracle confirms what the narrative has already swirled toward. The prophetic power belongs to God, and God now vests it in Elisha as the one who stands in the place of Elijah. The company of the prophets recognizes this as a public validation of succession. 2 Kings 2:14-15. The scene thus accomplishes what the mantle gesture began, a transfer of authority confirmed by a sign. A theological aside about the double portion bears repeating in full. Elisha's request is strategic and sobering. He asks not for twice as many wonders, but for a share of spirit that marks him as Elijah's heir. The phrase has legal resonance. It requests standing within a covenant community. Elisha is not seeking spectacular celebrity. He is asking to be invested in the continuity of prophetic office, to shoulder the labor. That posture, seeking responsibility rather than spectacle, frames much of Elisha's later ministry. Once Elisha steps into the office, his ministry is marked by a steady stream of acts that cluster around themes of restoration, provision, and everyday compassion. While Elijah's vocabulary of demonstration often pivots on dramatic confrontation, drought and fire, Elisha's catalogue reads more like a ministry of repair. He heals water, restores life, multiplies resources, neutralizes poison, feeds crowds, makes a city safe, and even restores a lost axe head. The body of work reads like an extended program of mending a society frayed by idolatry, war, and scarcity. Each miracle is an act of reweaving. Where life was broken, God's mercy mends. Where scarcity threatened, God provides. Consider first the small town of Jericho. When the people complain that the water there is unclean and unproductive, Elisha throws salt into the spring and prays. Kings 2:19-22. The spring is healed, the land is rendered fit for agriculture. The move is simple, salt and prayer, but it demonstrates a prophetic concern with everyday environmental and communal health. It's not an attention-grabbing spectacle, but a pragmatic restoration of what keeps life going, water that will not poison the people. The episode signals a ministry attentive to the structures of daily life. Then there is the household miracle of the widow of one of the company of prophets, 2 Kings 4:17. A widow faces the seizure of her 2 sons into indentured servitude to pay debts. Elisha asks what oil she has, receives a small jar, and instructs her to borrow empty vessels from her neighbors and pour the oil into them. The oil flows without end until the vessels are full. She sells the surplus, pays the debts, and has enough left to sustain her family. Theologically, this is striking. God's provision arrives not by a private treasure chest, but through communal sharing, a network of neighbors loaning jars, so that the miracle multiplies relationally. The miracle also addresses social vulnerability. The prophet's word rescues a widow from economic slavery. The pattern will recur, prophetic intervention on behalf of the vulnerable. The Shunammite story is one of the most tender scenes in Elisha's ministry, 2 Kings 4:8-37. A hospitable woman creates a room for the prophet when he passes through. She and her husband are childless. Elisha, aware of blessing opportunities, promises that she will have a son. She conceives and bears a boy. Years later, the child dies suddenly. The mother lays him on Elisha's bed, runs to find the prophet, and when she brings him to Elisha, he prays and stretches himself upon the child, again invoking the intimacy of bodily intercession, and the boy's life returns. 2 Kings 4:34-35. There are resonances here with Elijah's act with the widow in Zarephath, but Elisha's ministry here is framed by hospitality and human relationship. The prophet's presence is not merely ideological, it is embodied, arriving in the household that welcomed him. The miracle is therefore both personal and communal. A son is returned to his mother and to the household that had ministered to the prophet. A theological reflection helps to place these 2 revival scenes side by side. Both kings of life, the widow's son revived by Elijah and the Shunammite's son revived by Elisha, highlight that life is central in God's work. Restoration of life is not some extraordinary sideshow. It is the core of prophetic action. Whether through Elijah's desperate pleading or Elisha's measured intercession, God's activity centers on reversing death's claim. The pattern matters. prophets are midwives and resuscitators in a world where death and exile often seem to have final claim. Elisha's miracles also include more domestic and comic-feeling episodes that nevertheless carry theological weight. When the company of prophets prepares a stew from wild gourds, the pot becomes poisonous and threatens those who eat it. 2 Kings 4:38-41. Elisha throws flour into the pot, and the food is harmless again. The moment is almost humorous, yet the lesson is sober. God's prophet can neutralize what corrupts communal life, even in the smallest moments. It is a ministry that pays attention to the health of the table, as well as the altar. Likewise, the miracle of the multiplication of loaves, 2 Kings 4:42-44, gives with the same pastoral tone. A man brings 20 loaves made from first fruits to feed 100 men. Elisha commands the distribution, and the food is enough. There is no sermon about tithe and return here, only a demonstration that God supplies where need exists, and often in ways that encourage sharing so that scarcity becomes abundant for a community. Both the mundane and the magnificent appear in Elisha's life. There is the comic prophetic rescue of a borrowed axe head. A man loses the head of an iron axe in the Jordan. Elisha cuts a stick, throws it into the water where the axe head sunk, and the iron floats so it can be retrieved. 2 Kings 6:1-7. It is a small sign, yet for an agrarian society, the replacement of an axe can mean the difference between working the land or being crippled in production. The miracle addresses labor and the dignity of the worker. It is significant that prophetic power is not reserved for royal courts, but directed into the practical needs of ordinary people. Some of Elisha's acts move outward to the national and military stage. The narrative about the Aramean, Syrian, army shows prophetic foresight and mercy. The Syrians, under leaders like Ben-Hadad and later commanders, repeatedly seek to capture Elisha because of the advantage his prophetic insight gives Israel. 2 Kings 6:8-23. At one point, an entire army surrounds Dothan by night in search of the prophet. Elisha's servant panics, but Elisha prays that the servant's eyes be opened. When they are, he sees horses and chariots of fire around Elisha, an image that echoes the chariots of Elijah. 2 Kings 6:17. Instead of calling down destruction on the enemy, Elisha prays that their eyes be blinded and then leads them into Samaria. When their sight is restored, they find themselves in the presence of the king of Israel and are offered food instead of death. Kings 6:18-23. The story closes with surprising mercy. Rather than executing these captured soldiers, the king extends hospitality and releases them. The episode illustrates a prophetic posture that combines divine revelation with a humane politics, disarming enemies not by brute force, but by transforming fear into mercy. The most famous international episode in Elisha's ministry is the healing of Naaman, the commander of the Aramean army. 2 Kings 5. Naaman is a respected military leader, honored in the sight of his king, but he carries a humiliating illness, leprosy. In his desperation, he follows the suggestion of a captive Israelite servant girl, travels to Israel, and finally stands before Elisha seeking healing. The prophet does not perform for him in imperial fashion. Instead, Elisha sends a messenger instructing Naaman to wash in the Jordan 7 times. Naaman's initial pride bristles. He expects a personal, theatrical touch from a distinguished prophet, but when he obeys, his flesh becomes clean. Naaman's conversion is twofold. He receives physical healing and professes the God of Israel as the Lord. 2 Kings 5:15. The narrative thus models how God's mercy can cross national and religious boundaries. A foreign soldier is healed and humbled, becoming a witness to Yahweh's sovereignty. A sober corollary follows. Gehazi, Elisha's servant, is greedy. He runs after Naaman seeking reward, lies to gain gifts, and, When Elisha exposes the deception, Gehazi is struck with Naaman's leprosy, 2 Kings 5:20-27. The episode is a hard moral lesson. Prophetic ministry must be accompanied by personal integrity. The power of God is not a vending machine for personal enrichment. Gehazi's fate is a stark reminder that the prophet's authority must never be divorced from holiness of life. Elisha's ministry also intersects with larger social crises: famine, siege, and the collapse of city morale. In one extended sequence, the city of Samaria endures a siege so that food prices spike and people starve. 2 Kings 6:24-7:20. In the midst of famine, Elisha prophesies that within 24 hours there will be abundance, a claim that provokes cynical skepticism. The prophecy arrives via a strange vector. 4 leprous men at the city gate discover the enemy camp deserted because the Arameans have been driven off by terror, eating and looting one another. 2 Kings 7. The narrative moves from crisis to deliverance in a single sweep. The deliverance is not contrived. It involves psychological warfare and the collapse of the besieging army's cohesion. Elisha's word becomes the hinge that transforms a city's despair into jubilation. Again, the prophet's work is restorative, bringing back life to a community that had nearly died. It would be easy at this point to sequence Elisha's miracles as a tidy ledger of successes, but the Book of Kings refuses to let us spiritualize without nuance. The prophetic office is messy, full of human failure and divine grace. Elisha's death itself is recorded with the same sober realism. He dies, is buried, and later, when a man's body is hastily placed in Elisha's tomb, the corpse touches Elisha's bones and life returns. 2 Kings 13:20-21. The posthumous miracle is a startling coda. Even beyond death, the prophet's presence in the community remains a channel of life. The bones become a last testament to the ongoing potency of God's work through human instruments. Theologically, the scene suggests that God's work does not end with the life of any individual. Legacy continues to act in surprising ways. Throughout these accounts, the company of prophets, groups sometimes called the Sons of the Prophets, appear as a community of sustainment and training. They form nodes of prophetic life where teaching, testing, and prophetic practice are shared. These communities provide a corrective to the isolation that defined Elijah's early ministry. Where Elijah was often solitary, Elisha's ministry is communal, embedded in relationships with households, the corporate prophets, and kings. The pattern implies that prophetic power is not merely the charisma of a lone figure, but the fruit of communal formation. A recurring theological thread in both men's ministries is the humility of God's action. The scriptures are careful to credit every act to Yahweh. Prophets are instruments and witnesses. Whether fire falls on Mount Carmel at Elijah's prayer, 1 Kings 18, or Elisha's hands restore life and food, 2 Kings 4-7, the narrative insists that God is sovereign and that the prophet's role is to point, pray, and serve. The prophetic identity is therefore less about spectacle than stewardship. That stewardship can look like denunciation, as on Carmel. It can look like restoration, as in Jericho. It can look like hospitality or like the quiet placing of hands on a child. The variety resists simplistic formulas for how God works. Historical and cultural notes can deepen our reading without reducing the narrative to a museum text. Baal worship, for instance, was often tied to fertility rites and agricultural cycles. When Israel turns to Baal, they are not merely adopting a competing theology. They are aligning their hopes for life and harvest to a different cosmic power. Elijah's confrontation with Baal is therefore not abstract. It is a conflict over life-sustaining trust. Similarly, prophets like Elijah and Elisha were often travel-worn, wearing coarse garments and living on the fringes of palaces and villages. Their authority was not measured by courtly titles, but by fidelity to covenantal speech, which included both warning and consolation. Commentators across the centuries have noted the contrast between Elijah's towering spectacles and Elisha's domestic economy of grace. One modern reader paraphrases, "Elijah's ministry declares God's holiness. Elisha's ministry shows God's mercy in ordinary life. Both are necessary, both are prophetic. Elijah cleanses, Elisha restores. Elijah confronts national idolatry. Elisha rebuilds the social fabric the idolatry had frayed." These two strands, confrontation and restoration, form a balanced prophetic theology. Prophecy is a call to fidelity, a demand for truth, a defense against idolatry. At the same time, prophecy is medicine, administered in households, at city gates, on battlefields, in the presence of kings. The work is therefore both judicial and compassionate. To separate the two is to impoverish the tradition. It is important to keep certain theological boundaries in view. Neither scripture nor wise tradition allows us to turn these narratives into a set of mechanical steps that guarantee miraculous results. The narratives present God acting freely, sometimes to vindicate, sometimes to restore, often in ways that subvert human expectations. We must resist the temptation to extract universal formulas. Instead, the text invites us to pattern our lives with its virtues: faithfulness to God's call, readiness to serve, integrity in ministry, concern for the vulnerable, and openness to God's surprising means. This invitation moves from the ancient scene to concrete applications for the church today. What does it mean to discover their prophetic power in our context? First, prophetic power must be recast as stewardship rather than performance. It is the energy that points people toward God, not toward a leader. Churches and ministries must therefore emphasize training, apprenticeship, the sons and daughters of prophetic communities, over charismatic celebrity. Mentorship is crucial. Elijah's calling of Elisha models how leaders must invest in successors. The transfer of mantle is a theological act. It requires intentionality, sacrifice, and a community that recognizes legitimacy. Second, prophetic power serves life. Elijah's and Elisha's ministries stress the restoration of life above spectacle. In practical terms, that means ministry that attends to the marginal, widows and captives, the sick and the economically vulnerable. Elisha's work in healing water, providing oil and feeding hungry crowds, is a template for ministries that fix broken systems rather than merely perform prophetic pronouncements. The prophetic vocation in the church should therefore include public witness and social compassion, confronting injustice while investing in structures that sustain life. Third, the narrative gives pastoral resources for dealing with burnout and discouragement. Elijah's collapse under a broom tree is an honest mirror for anyone who has labored for justice or truth and found themselves emptied. God's response to Elijah, food, rest, a soft voice, should form part of contemporary pastoral care. Leaders need Sabbath companions and opportunities to hear God again in whispers. The prophetic imagination requires spaces for quiet formation. Noise and spectacle will not substitute for a nourished soul. Fourth, the concept of the faithful remnant is an invitation to perseverance. God's revelation to Elijah that 7,000 had not bowed to Baal, 1 Kings 19:18, names a hopeful reality. Faithfulness can exist even where numbers are small. For churches in minority positions or under cultural pressure, the remnant motif offers consolation and a summons to faithful presence. Small, faithful communities can be engines of restoration. Fifth, the examples of Gehazi and Naaman provide ethical boundaries. Gehazi's greed shows that proximity to power demands purity. Prophetic influence can tempt into exploitation. Naaman's conversion, on the other hand, shows that God's mercy can cross national lines. The prophetic vocation, therefore, must be coupled with ethical integrity and a horizon that goes beyond tribal loyalties. Consider an analogy to modern mentorship. A seasoned pastor who trains a younger colleague in preaching, counseling, and community engagement is performing a similar transfer to Elijah's mantle. The transfer is not merely a training course. It is an embodied entrusting of responsibility. A composite testimony, drawn from many lives, helps illustrate a ministry veteran who, after years of burnout, found restoration through Sabbath rhythms, and a younger leader who stepped into the public role illustrates the same pattern of dependence and continuity that marks Elijah and Elisha. The veteran's rest and the novices taking up are both essential to the life of the church. There are also concrete practices the narrative invites, cultivating communities where older and younger leaders share ministry, where prophetic critique is married to pastoral care, and where acts of practical mercy are as highly valued as public proclamation, will create churches that embody the balance of Elijah and Elisha. Training programs that include hands-on service, feeding ministries, water projects, hospital chaplaincy, mirror Elisha's concern for life's practicalities. Biblical integrity requires we acknowledge that prophetic ministry is not immune to tragedy or failure. The violent deaths on Carmel, Gehazi's fall, and the political intrigues remind us of the costliness of covenant leadership. Yet even in hardship, God's sovereignty and mercy shine through. The stories do not promise that every faithful prophet will be spared suffering. They do show that God works through broken vessels to effect healing and justice. As a final theological synthesis, prophetic power is the intersection of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. It announces God's standard, corrects idolatry, and acts to restore life. It is passed through relationships, mantles thrown, cloaks picked up, apprentices trained, so that authority is not a possession, but a charge. The double portion that Elisha requests is ultimately about being recognized as a steward who will accept the burdens of leadership. The mantle, whether literal cloak or figurative responsibility, is not an ornament. It is active duty. Returning to the title that has guided our journey, the incredible journey of Elijah and Elisha, discover their prophetic power. The phrase discover implies both historical recovery and contemporary appropriation. We recover the narrative, prophets who spoke for God, who confronted idolatry, who restored life, and who taught through presence and example. We also appropriate its lessons. Prophetic power today must be understood as service, as stewardship, as a commitment to life and integrity. Those who long for the signs and wonders should not dismiss the quieter labors, the healing of a spring, the feeding of 100, the saving of a widow's children. These are no less miraculous in God's economy than fire from heaven. If you have followed the ark from the droughted hills to the chariot of fire, from the widow's jar to the healed slave of a foreign king, one conviction should remain clear. Prophecy is not primarily about spectacle. It is about God's will being enacted through lives that are willing to serve, suffer, and steward. The prophetic life is costly and communal, dramatic and domestic, judgmental when necessary, and tender when required. Let these narratives hold you in equal parts awe and sobriety. Emulate the courage of Elijah when truth must be declared. Mirror the compassion of Elisha when people need restoration. Seek mentorship and be a mentor. Guard integrity as though lives depend on it, because they sometimes do. Expect God to act in surprising ways, through ravens, through neighbors' jars, through foreign soldiers, and be ready to receive those gifts with humility. If this journey through Elijah and Elisha has stirred you, share which moment moved you most in the comments below. Tell us whether it was the cliffside confrontation, the whisper at Horeb, the mantle falling into a young prophet's hands, or one of Elisha's quiet restorations. If you found meaning here, subscribe and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that prophetic power, Real power is the authority to restore life, steward mercy, and pass the mantle of responsibility to the next faithful generation.